sets are measuring. Now, there's uncertainty in all these data sets, of course, but the fact that there's central estimates on each of them so very widely diverge does indicate that they've got severe problems with being able to obtain even a reliable measurement, let alone a reliable prediction of what's going to happen in the future. So all of this begins to cast ever greater doubt on the science behind the global warming scare, which is a science essentially based on those exaggerated predictions made by the likes of James Hansen before Congress in 1988, and then the IPCC following on, not quite so extreme, but very nearly so, in 1990. And ever since then, they've been rowing back on those predictions, most notably in their 2013 report, where they actually went so far as almost to halve their short-term to medium-term predictions of how much warming we were going to get, while leaving those longer-term predictions unchanged. So that was the context in which Senator Cruz decided he would hold this debate. And he held up my graph showing that on the RSS satellite data set, there had been at that time no global warming for 18 years and 9 months. He'd had a blow-up of it made, and he held it up in front of the committee and said to the witness for the Democrats, what do you have to say to this? And the witness for the Democrats was not a climate scientist. He was a naval officer, retired as far as I could see. He was certainly gaga. And he said, well, of course, other records show there has been some warming. And there was no real follow-through from Cruz's side. He didn't say, but do they show the rate of warming that was predicted? Because, of course, they don't. So I think the hearing was quite helpful, as you say, because it reminded us that not only is the science on this uncertain, and uncertain to a degree which those who have been putting forward this scare have never themselves understood, but it's also now increasingly understood by governments that the science is uncertain. The British government is still with its head firmly stuck in the sand. Most European governments, of course, the European government, the commissars who now make 5/6 of our laws, they all buy into this global warming rubbish. But increasingly, they are finding themselves at odds with the general taxpayer, who is fed up with paying double or triple the electricity prices he was paying 10 years ago, even though you've had these massive falls in the price, the raw material price of coal, oil and gas. Despite these great reductions, the price to the customer has doubled or even tripled in some countries, and solely because of this global warming scare and the enormous transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, which this entails. Every landowner in Scotland is trying to get windmills put up on his land now. He doesn't care about how many birds and bats he kills. What he's concerned about is the millions he can make in subsidies. In fact, I had a wind farm stopped recently off the coast of Dorset. The people there wrote to me and they said, you have all the economic arguments as to why these things don't work economically as well as scientifically. Can you put in a paper to the government on it? Which I did. And I said, what is really going on here? This is a backdoor way of getting taxpayers to fund political parties. And all the political parties, except in Britain, UKIP, which opposes this nonsense from top to bottom, are on the scam. What they're doing is they're saying, we will give you the wind farms you apply for, provided you undertake privately round the back with nods and winks to give us a large proportion of the subsidy from the taxpayers that we give you. Let me indicate to you how very large the subsidy to just one wind farm can be. Had this wind farm 9 miles off the Needles, one of the great beauty spots of Britain, been allowed, and I'm glad to say we have stopped it, we've stamped on it, it's now not going to happen. Had it been allowed, the total subsidy paid by taxpayers, well, let's play a little game, Paul. Why don't you give a guess as to how much subsidy that wind farm would have got over the next 20 years in total?
Oh, would it run into the millions?
As much as that, you think? How many millions would you say?
Per farm?
Yeah, one wind farm. This is one wind farm.
How many windmills?
200.
Ooh, beyond my mind. The way that knowing how these guys operate and how much money they've spent up until now, it does it really matter?
Well, I'll give you the figure then. It's $8 billion.
Was that a million or billion?
Billion. $8 billion for one wind farm. That was what the subsidy would have worked out at.
One wind farm
And that is using
with 200
one
windmills.
200 windmills, each 600 feet high. They were going to generate electricity that would have entitled them at the current strike price, which is lower than what they would have paid a year ago. But it's quite a bit lower. It's about a third, 50% down. But it's still, they would have got $8 billion. And that figure did not appear in any of their documentation. But I wrote to the government, I said, this is what the planning inspector, I said, this is what this one wind farm is going to get in subsidy at the current strike price. $8 billion. And I said, this, on any view, is corruption from top to bottom. If this goes ahead, then I will judicially review it in the High Court in London, and I will bring forward the evidence that political parties are getting large kickbacks from the operators of wind farms, who are and they are now in effect using the whole global warming thing as a scam to fund their own partisan political operations with.
Wow.
And that is what this has been reduced to now. That's why they're all clinging to this. That's why they're all not letting go. It's because they're all making so much money out of it, both individually, because a lot of these MPs are landowners, but also as political parties, because the grateful recipients of largesse to the tune of $8 billion for one wind farm are naturally going to recycle the odd few $100 million back into the pockets of the politicians who gave them the permissions. That's how the game is played. And so now that they know we're watching, we actually put them in a very difficult position, which is why they had in the end to turn this particular proposal down. I wrote to them and said, please can you tell me whether it is legitimate under current rules about what you can and cannot object to, because they've stacked it so you can't make normal objections to these things. I said, am I allowed to object on the ground that the political parties are using this as money laundering? And they wouldn't reply. And I wrote again and said, if you don't reply, and if you proceed and grant this, then I will, on judicial review, apply for review, among other things, on the grounds of abuse of process, in that I asked you a legitimate question about whether I was allowed to complain on a certain ground as a matter of the rules, and you did not answer. And I said, if you carry on with this any longer, we will shut you down in the courts for years. And they backed off and they said, okay, with this one, we won't go any further. So first thing is, if you are British and you are watching this and somebody is trying to put a wind farm somewhere where you don't want a wind farm, get in touch and I will have it stopped. Because they're running frightened of this now. Already on the, as far as land-based windmills are concerned, the government has got the message that it's not going to subsidise those anymore, and 2,500 projects that were in the pipeline have been cancelled. So all this talk you hear about how wind power is coming close to breaking even, no, it isn't. It's nowhere even close.
No.
And this withdrawal of subsidy for all new projects has revealed that very, very clearly. What we're now pressing for is a withdrawal of subsidies from all existing projects. Now, that's difficult because the government very stupidly contractually bound itself to pay subsidies for the 25 or 20-year life of these projects. And so they are under a contractual obligation which theoretically only Parliament through a primary legislation could reverse. However, it's open to us to argue, and we are arguing, that all those in the industry know perfectly well that this is basically nonsense. It has no contribution to make to solving the supposed climate problem, even supposing that there is one. And that if it did solve it, it would solve it at a cost which is altogether disproportionate. That they knew this at every material time. And that therefore they entered fraudulently into the contract with the government, and they should not therefore be entitled to the future benefit of it. What is also interesting, looking into the details of this, because we were gearing up for this big judicial review, which on this particular case now doesn't have to happen, is that the Department of Energy and Climate Change, which is full of the most amazing pointy heads. I've been in there and met the House of Lords Minister there, and what a joke that was. They had no idea how much all this was costing them. And I looked at their accounts recently to see whether they had put down as what are known as contingent but as yet uncrystallized liabilities the amounts of money they are going to have to pay out to the owners of all the existing wind farms that are already there, plus the new ones offshore that they're still going to grant. And I found, sure enough, a large figure for these accrued but not yet realized liabilities. So I looked a little more carefully and I found that that entire accrual was for decommissioning of nuclear power stations. They haven't actually made any provision in the accounts of the department for paying the future subsidies, which are, as far as I can gather, it probably is now around $100,000 to $200,000 million, and they have made no provision in the accounts. Now, if any commercial firm had behaved like that, they would go to jail for fraud, because that's false accounting. And I am about to write to the permanent secretary of the department, who is the chief accounting officer of the department, drawing his attention to this failure on his part to report these contingent liabilities in such a very, very large sum, to require him to do so, and to explain very clearly that unless he does do so, I will be going to the police and I will be expecting them to prosecute for false accounting.
Wow.
And I think this is how we're going to deal with this in the end. It's going to be just like Eliot Ness dealing with Al Capone. Al Capone was too clever and too thuggish, and he was willing to smash the knuckles of any witness who dared to testify against him. So they couldn't get him for the real crimes of bootlegging and drug running and numbers rackets and all the other things that he got up to. So they got him in the end for tax evasion. And what we're going to do to these climate people is we can't get them for their climate frauds because the police just say, oh, it's all too difficult, we can't understand it, even when the fraud is absolutely blatant. The police will just look stupid and blink owlishly at you and say, well, it's all beyond us, we don't understand it, and if we don't, the jury won't. Of course, the jury will understand it in two shakes of a duck's tail, but the police know which side of the blanket their bread is buttered, politically speaking, and at the moment they don't dare raise fraud prosecutions against the tiny clique of scientists worldwide. It's not the whole scientific community. It's really a couple of dozen people I've had my eye on who are causing all the trouble between them. And the rest of the scientific community is terrified to speak out against them for fear that these shrieking harpies from these very lavishly funded green groups will come in and destroy their reputations. This is how the scam is operated to keep the scientific community quiet, while 24 scamsters get away with spreading all these bogus nonsense. But the way we can bring government's attention to this is to do exactly what I did with this wind farm in Dorset, to write to ministers and say, if you proceed any further with this, you will be in court for your crimes in relation to this particular scam. And that gets their attention every time. So when the chief accounting officer of the Department of Energy and Climate Change, the permanent secretary of the department, a very senior civil servant, gets a letter drawing his attention to a blatant and serious instance, of false accounting on his part, then he is going to wet himself. Because the one thing these people don't like is for these scams to come home to them individually. Now, ministers are more or less untouchable. Our constitution is very strange. You can do almost anything, however criminal, if you're a minister, and get away with it. There are very few checks and balances. There is judicial review, which works if a minister does something which is so obviously corrupt that it shouldn't be allowed, or so obviously mad that it shouldn't be allowed. If no rational minister, even in the most ultimate exercise of the most generous discretion, could possibly have taken the decision the minister took, then you could bring the minister to book. But even then it's difficult and very expensive. But if they commit false accounting in his department, don't go after the minister, go after the permanent secretary, because it is his job to make sure that the accounts are properly kept. And in this case, they clearly haven't been. It's a very, very serious hole in the accounts. And I'm going to say to him, have I misread them? Have I misunderstood it? If so, please let me know. If I haven't, you've got 4 weeks to get your minister to issue a statement in the House correcting these accounts, failing which the matter will then be passed to the police. And if they don't prosecute, their decision not to prosecute will be judicially reviewed.
Wow.
And this very simple mechanism is how the individual citizen, not using very much money, can make absolutely sure that these people start cleaning up their act. And the moment they do have to clean up their act, they themselves will see the monstrous absurdity of what they're doing. Which is a rather long introduction to your main question, which is obviously about the COP21, the Conference of the Parties, and what went on there. Well, I'm glad to say that if you remember our earlier conversations on this, I said the most important requirement from the point of view of liberty and democracy was that there should be, as there was not in the first draft of this treaty, a provision known as a cessation clause by which any nation wishing to break free of the whole process simply gives a year's notice, and after that year's notice is worked out, they have no obligations whatsoever of any kind to anyone. No more payments, no more sending information to central bureaucracies, nothing. The whole thing stops. And I'm glad to say that after a certain amount of vigorous manoeuvring behind the scenes, and talking to one or two very friendly governments who were extremely firm in saying they would not proceed with signing this treaty unless there were a secession clause, it was hastily reinserted, actually in the second draft, and I held my breath in the hope that it would survive all the way through to the final draft, but fortunately the governments that I had put up to this were willing to stand by it all the way, and they made it very plain to the Secretariat at the earliest stage that if there was any nonsense whatsoever, if that clause was taken out or diluted in any way, they would vote down the entire process, and that would be the end of it. So, of course, the Secretariat bowed to that, and that means that it's now open to any nation to do what Canada did a few years ago under Stephen Harper, what Japan has done, what Russia has done, and that is simply to opt out of the whole process and have nothing further to do with it, because the Kyoto Protocol contained just such a secession clause, and several countries have taken advantage of that.
So there was so there's a get out clause at any time that each government.
That's it. It's Article 28. If you're a real treaty nerd, you can go look it up. Article 28. It was originally Article 25, and then of course they always put extra articles in, so it became Article 28, and that is worded very similarly to the Kyoto Protocol secession clause. These are standard clauses in international agreements of this kind, and I was very pleased to see that despite the best efforts of the communist left, we did manage to get that inserted, and that it survived all the way through and is part of the official final draft. So that means that this is not, and this is a very important point, this is not a binding treaty. If it were a binding treaty, there would be no option to withdraw.
Because that was a concern, wasn't it? That was the major concern that everyone was thinking about, that once they sign up and we're stuck, well, that's it, we're doomed there. We sell our sovereignty and we have
that's
no...
it.
Yeah?
And now we retain our sovereignty, because if at any time we wake up and come off the Kool-Aid and say, well, hang on a moment, there's been no global warming now for 2.5 decades, and it's just not happening as they predicted, and maybe there's something wrong with the equations, and then they start to dig, and they'll find what I found when I started to dig, that every single variable they use is questionable. And that in every case they've taken the highest possible value, and in some cases the highest impossible value, in order to make it look as though there might be a problem. Once governments actually start to look at this, it's all going to fall apart. Getting them to start looking at it is going to become easier, because in the next financial year there is going to be severe financial crisis in at least one Western country, caused by the massive accumulation of government debt. Australia won't be that way, probably because under the John Howard administration, you actually ran a surplus. And of course, then very quickly the left came in and spent the surplus and began running up debt. But Australia has nothing like as bad a debt problem as, say, Britain has. We are more indebted as a percentage of GDP than Greece. So we have real financial problems. America, likewise under Obama, has doubled its national debt in a single administration. This is unprecedented in human history.
Yes, that's true. I saw that.
This man had been out to destroy the government of the United States and the nation deliberately. This is how you would do it. You run up a massive debt that future generations can never hope to repay, and then you just wait until eventually the creditors start gathering and demand repayment and refuse to lend any more until they get repaid. And once that happens, you get a Greek situation. The Greek situation was contained for one reason and one reason only. The European dictatorship is desperate that Britain should vote to stay in the European Union when either later this year or more probably next year there is finally a vote of the British people on whether we stay in the European dictatorship or break free and come out. And therefore the European dictatorship, these commissars by whom we are now governed, and who now account for 5 laws in every 6 that are made in Britain. They're made by our parliaments only because we are told we have to, by the commissars. So most of our very nearly all our legislation now is dictated by these unelected commissars.
Wow.
They are now facing considerable difficulty, because if we come out and we pay for about half of all the costs of the European Union, and all the other nations between them pay the rest, because Tony Blair made an extraordinary concession in the hope that he could buy the presidency of the European Union and the free jet that it comes with, using British taxpayers' money. Well, they took the British taxpayers' money and they then didn't give him the presidency. But it's very expensive. And they therefore want to keep us in. And they know that if Greece is expelled from the euro before Britain votes, Britain will realise to a man what a ludicrous joke the European Union has become, and will vote by a very large majority to get out. So Greece has worked this out, and it is playing a very crafty game. It knows that it can make any demand it wants of the European Union at the moment, and the European Union will simply pay it. The European Central Bank will be told by the politicians, just pay Greece whatever it takes to keep them quiet, just until Britain has had its referendum. And that's why there's been all this talk about Britain being made to go early for a referendum, maybe as early as even the spring of this year, because the cost of bailing out Greece continuously in this way is very severe, and the commissars would rather spare themselves that. So they've been saying to Cameron, for God's sake, have your vote and get it out of the way so that we can stop subsidising Greece and throw it out of the euro. And so this is what's all going on behind the scenes. In the meantime, of course, the European Union's nations are all running up massive debts, even Germany, because of this climate nonsense. Germany has, I think, 7 times as many windmills as Britain does, and Britain's got far too many, goodness knows. And so their whole energy infrastructure is falling apart. They can no longer maintain a stable and continuous electricity supply to their industries, because they've got too large a fraction of the grid generated by this variable wind power. And so they're having to increasingly rely on heavy costs from the interconnect with other European countries so that they can stabilise their grid. And this is costing them an arm and a leg, and Germany is going to go bankrupt as a result of its Energiewende. And these were the nations who sat there and postured and gestured like ninnies in this conference in Paris about how we had to go on destroying the economies of the West for the sake of not solving a 21st century non-problem using 14th century technology, windmills. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
Yeah.
It really is the most extraordinary intellectual aberration of modern times. And it's very strange that the news media, who could be digging into all this and exposing story after story after story of the, as you now know, multi-billion pound corruption that even individual projects are involved in, they sit there on their hands and they don't say or allow a word to be printed or spoken in the way that I'm speaking to you now. The information I'm giving you now is interesting. It's easily verifiable. You can go and look up the accounts of the Department of Energy and Climate Change. You can find that they do not make a provision for the payments they've got to make for the next 20 years on each of the wind farms that they've agreed to subsidise. This is, as I say, hundreds of billions of dollars that they have deliberately not accounted for, because if people start realising just how much this is costing, they're going to scream blue bloody murder and say we're not doing it. Mm. So this corruption runs very deep, and I think it's via the corruption that we are going to be able to deal with this. And so one of the things that happened during the COP21 conference was a meeting organised by a clergyman, the Reverend Philip Foster from England. He's been very active in this field for many years. And he invited several of us to go. And at that conference, Professor Niklas Mörner, who's been a professor now for, I think, 50 years, who is the ranking world's expert on sea level rise, and who says, of course, that it isn't rising at anything like the rate predicted, and nor is it going to do so. It's the same as with temperature. He has established, along with quite a big network of scientists right across Europe and America, an organization called the Independent Committee on Geoethics. And this idea was originally thought up by a Czech geoscientist, Václav Nemec, who had already done some activity in this area. He said, really, you need to have one of these for climate science. And so it was at the initiative of Nemec and then chiefly of Niklas Mörner that this new international committee was set up. And they said to me, would I like to circulate a paper to the board suggesting that there should be a fraud investigation team established under the board so that we could look at various instances of outright scientific fraud and then report them, first of all, investigate, get sworn statements, do it as though we were the police and just quietly investigating. Then hand the report to the board. These are all eminent professors. And they then look at it and they say, have we made what on the face of it appears to be a case that a fraud has been committed? If they say yes, then we're going to ask them to lend their weight as a group of serious international professors of the kind of standing of people like Nicholas Merner. And they put their name to report saying, we commissioned this report by the investigating team. It produced this report. We have examined it. We have determined that there is clearly, on the face of things, evidence that fraud has been committed by the following people in the following ways. And we require the police in the countries concerned to investigate those frauds. Now, this is a very powerful technique, because if an individual like me reports a fraud to the police, I reported one or two as a sort of trial run to see what would happen, and they're not going to pay any attention to an individual. However strong the evidence, however clearly a fraud's been committed, they're just not going to go there. They've got too many other things to do. They've got to catch people speeding at 31 miles an hour and a 30-mile limit. They haven't got time to go and chase real criminals. So they won't respond. But if you get, instead, a serious committee of international professors sending them all the documents dressed up and the signed statements and everything attested to in front of solicitors and ready to go, and then you say to them, you do this, or we will judicially review your failure to do it, then the police have to take notice. And if the evidence is that there is a prima facie case for fraud, they've got to come up with an extremely good reason why they shouldn't prosecute. And we think that in the end, the police are going to cave in. We think it'll take 3 or 4 reports from that committee identifying elements of this overall fraud on the climate that are being practiced in different countries. I mean, we might look at one in Australia where, for instance, it was claimed quite falsely that there was a consensus about global warming on the part of the scientific community, when the data collected by the researchers who reported that that consensus was 97% showed that they themselves thought it was only 0.3%. And it's that kind of discrepancy where you can see that they themselves, their data collected shows one thing and they report something completely different. That's fraud. And so that's one that is already in the hands of the police, and they're looking at that, and they have got as far with us as saying that a deception is certainly present. So we're now gathering the evidence on that. That will go to the committee. That will then go to the police in Australia, in Britain, and in the United States, and to Interpol. Because Interpol, we're going to try and persuade them to open a file on this, so that when these serious reports that go through, first of all, the process of proper investigation by trained investigators, and then a proper supervision by an independent board of professors who will look at this and say, oh, come off it, this isn't fraud, or yes, it is, and we'll pass it on. That then goes to the police in different countries and to Interpol, and they find that this is happening all over the place. The IPCC has committed fraud, individual members of it have committed fraud, there's things like the hockey stick graph, there's a number of frauds connected with that graph. I'm not tying this to any individual, but a lot of individuals who have taken advantage of that graph have definitely committed frauds, in my opinion. And so we will be putting the evidence together and then putting it to the Geoethics Committee, which will then, in its name, forward this to the police authorities. And in the end, when they keep getting these reports, the Climate Change Committee in Britain has just issued a report which is essentially fraudulent, in that it says the science is settled, when on the matters it's claiming a settled science, they know that it isn't. And we can show that they know that it isn't. So it's not just accidental, not they've been carried along with the tide of General Guff. The people who are on this committee know that the report that's issued in their name is false. And so we are putting that also, I'm working on it at the moment, that will go up to the committee, and then if they think it right, that will go to the police. And one by one, these reports will arrive, all of them expressed in the very clearest terms, because we're not going to get into complications. I mean, if, for instance, there's an argument about whether one particular variable in the equation of climate sensitivity should be one value or should it be 10% up or 10% down on that, that's not the kind of thing you can put in front of a jury. Legitimate scientific dissent isn't fraud. But if there is a deliberate misreporting of data, where we know the data collected was said one thing, and we know that they have said and continue to say completely the opposite thing, that's fraud. And that fraud is going to stop. Because eventually Interpol is going to crack. They're going to get these reports from different countries. They're going to be talking to the police in these countries saying, what are you going to do? And the police will at first say, well, this is such a political hot potato, we don't want to touch it. Interpol is eventually going to say to them, look, sorry, but there is an organized, systematic, international fraud. It involves a couple of dozen scientists and a few other bureaucrats and hangers-on and millionaires and big businesses. And it's the most expensive fraud in human history, and you've got to investigate those elements of that fraud which are being perpetrated in your country. So we think...
Sorry, I just want to... You mentioned the word fraud, corruption, jury. Yeah. I'm thinking of the report literally signaling out individuals that are not politicians because they have a sense of diplomatic immunity to some degree.
Yeah.
But we're talking about individuals who can be prosecuted for this, if you can use the word crime, corruption, however you want to address it.
But it is in the British terms, it's a serious imprisonable offence. And the offence of fraud, you have to pass a number of tests before it counts as fraud. There has to be a deception. The deception has to be deliberate, and they have to do it with intent either to profit one group of people or to cause loss to another, or both. So you have to prove two kinds of intent: the intent to deceive, whether or not the intent was successful, neither here nor there. The question is there an intent to deceive? And then the second element is, did they intend either to profit or to profit some of their mates, or to cause loss, say, to the general taxpayer by arguing that we must have policies based on the deception that they were publishing. I can think of one paper, again in Australia, where an entirely inaccurate result was reported, and the authors said, and this result shows the need for policies to address climate change. What are these policies? They are policies to raise taxes and thereby cause loss to taxpayers, who would not otherwise be exposed to that loss were it not for the bogus statistics published in this paper. That's fraud. That's the absolute classic definition of what is known as fraud by false representation.
So given that you've just described this, and we're going to put, this is obviously part of the Lord Monckton YouTube channel, and obviously this kind of, I guess, revelation is getting out there. Who should be afraid?
Everyone who has deliberately published false scientific results or made false statements about scientific results published by other people, intending thereby to deceive and intending thereby either to cause a profit somewhere or to cause a loss somewhere. Anyone who has done that, and there aren't many who have, as I say, it's about a couple of dozen, but those couple of dozen are covered for by the rest of the scientific community and by governments, because they're all making so much money out of it, and because this is where the people who are going to find it hardest to get after are the Greenpeaces of this world, and these big, lavishly funded international communist advocacy groups now waving a green flag rather than a red one or the black one with a swastika on it, as they would have done in past generations. The green flag of environmentalism is the new totalitarianism. And these people are routinely issuing statements they know to be untrue, or they are reckless as to whether they are true or not. And even that is a fraud. You don't have to know that what you're saying is false. But if you say that it's true, and you don't know whether it's true or false, that too is a lie. It is a deception. You're making out that you know things you actually don't know.
Yeah.
And that is just as much a fraud as if you actually know that what you're publishing is wrong.
That last statement would cover quite a lot of journalists in the media.
Indeed it would.
And I recall that young man that was interviewing you at the property up in Adelaide, where he was being so confident of his questions, but as soon as I turned the camera on him and I was recording him, he toned down and he wasn't speaking so cocky because he didn't know. But he was making out as if though he knew what he was talking about, and it's sad that the media have such an influence on the minds of people.
That's what they all do. And so some journalists are in our line of sight, because there are one or two who have been persistent and notorious in making stuff up and publishing it and saying, well, under freedom of speech rules, you can't challenge whatever lie I choose to tell. I mean, they don't quite get that far, but that seems to be how they behave. And some of those are going to find that their heads will roll. And it'll be very interesting watching to see whether their newspapers and their, BBC, whoever it is, stand by them when these fraud charges are brought, and whether they will say, well, we'll pay for your defense, because a fraud is a fraud. And the reason why fraud is such a good one to go after, not only is that it's happening on such a widespread scale now, and so far more or less entirely unchallenged, but also that it is the kind of offence where if somebody is convicted and slammed up in prison for 10 years, he's not made himself a martyr to the cause by doing that. That's the point. Often if you imprison your political opponents, they become the martyrs and they in the end win. One thinks of Nelson Mandela, who was guilty of his participation in the Rivonia plot, which would have caused probably a couple of dozen deaths had it succeeded. And he went quite properly to prison for life for that. And then in the end, for political reasons of expediency, he got out, because blowing up white people was not regarded as unacceptable among the supporters of Nelson Mandela. So he was a hero to the international left precisely because he had planned to blow up and kill and maim white people. The left are very much more closely supportive of terrorism than they would like to admit if you put it to them straight. But he became a hero, but nobody becomes a hero if they have been convicted of a shoddy little fraud. And that means that we will be sending probably only 2 or 3 people to prison. It'll take us 2 or 3 years to get them there. But once they're there, and once people have seen shock horror that you can not get away any longer with telling lies about the climate for your own profit or to other people's loss, because if you do, Monckton and Co. will be watching, and they'll turn you in to Mr. Plod, and Mr. Plod, having tried at first to refuse to prosecute in these cases, is eventually going to have to. They can't just ignore the scale and systematic way in which this fraud is being pursued by a relatively small number of people, with a whole lot of useful idiots trailing along behind them. And most journalists who have participated in this have done so on the basis of staggering ignorance. And just because you're an ignorant journalist doesn't necessarily make you a fraudster. So we have to be very careful not to overclaim, not to start making accusations against people where it's at all borderline. We're going after the real crooks, the people who know perfectly well that they have lied and continue to lie even after being warned not to. Where their universities have covered for them, and there's been 1 or 2 cases of that, we will be going after the universities first and the individuals later, because the universities, politically speaking, are a much better target. You go after some hapless little scientific researcher, he'll say, oh, look, the money interests are coming to try and prosecute me, and he might wriggle out from under the jury, might be sympathetic. But if a university covers up for him, when you write to the university and say, please do an ethics investigation, this guy has reported this result which he knows isn't true, and the university does a whitewash instead of investigating properly, then the university is an accessory after the fact of fraud, because it has put its name behind that deception when it knows perfectly well that it shouldn't. And it continues to get, of course, fat government grants for peddling the climate nonsense. And so you can show profit, you can show also the loss that the general taxpayer is already sustaining, and user of electricity and user of petrol because of the extra prices they're having to pay. So the financial side of this is relatively easy to prove, and that's not always the case. So this is looking like a very promising technique. We've obviously spoken to one or two senior police officers over the years. They have encouraged us to go down this route. They said, you've got to be businesslike about this. It's no good just waving your hands excitedly and saying in a loose sort of way that people are committing fraud. You've got to do the homework, roll up your sleeves, do the investigation, come to us, we'll investigate further, and then, if we find that you're in essence right, and then we'll put it to the public prosecutors. And then if they turn around and say, no, they won't prosecute, they've got to tell us why they won't so that we can tell you.
Yeah.
And if they don't give us good reasons, then, you can go after them in the civil courts on a process known as judicial review of administrative action if they take a decision not to prosecute, when no reasonable prosecutor in those circumstances could possibly have refused a prosecution, then the court can invite them to reconsider. The court can't actually tell them they've got to prosecute. It can invite them to reconsider, and if it does and they don't, then they can be done for contempt of court. The public officials are very well protected against us going after them.
Yeah.
But there are ways, and I've used them before. I've used them actually against the secret police in Britain some years ago on a completely different matter on behalf of some then consultancy clients of mine. And the police had behaved very badly. I won't bore you with the details.